Today's headline is Jim Kilfoile's Big Bone Heaps, a man in the Texas Panhandle who had an idea. The subheadline says, people called him Boney Jim. He collected buffalo bones in great piles and made $25,000 when the railroad was put through. Those who formerly ridiculed him then realized that there was value in bones. This article originally came from the New York Sun. It says, 10 years ago, there was not a better known character on the State Plains of Texas than Boney Jim Kilfoile. Notwithstanding the fact that he was a well-built man, of medium height, weighing at least 160 pounds, no one who knew him was ever known to question his right to the title of Boney. It was applied to him not so much on account of the prominence of his bones, as on account of their number. He probably had more of them than any other human being, certainly more than any other Texan. While ordinarily men managed to worry along with about 206 bones, Mr. Kilfoile had millions of them. They were his by right of discovery, by right of appropriation, and by right of the fact that nobody cared to run the risks incidental to taking them away from him. They were mostly buffalo bones, though there were perhaps half a dozen or more different kinds mixed with them. There was another name by which Boney Jim was not unfrequently called, and that was Crazy Jim. This latter name was largely dropped after the first railroad went through the Panhandle, and it was not considered respectful enough for a man of the financial standing which Mr. Kilfoile then attained. It is a fact, as well recognized in the Panhandle as elsewhere, that only poor men can be crazy. A rich man can only be eccentric. It was only in the early part of the 80s that Mr. Kilfoile was considered crazy. During that time, he was hauling freight from Fort Worth and Sherman out to Mobeetie. He drove 4 yoke of oxen and hauled his freight in the big prairie schooners familiar to all who have read about the typical freighter on the plains. As long as he was actively engaged in his regular work, there was no special peculiarity to be noticed about him. It was only on his return trips and during his idle days that the alleged craziness developed itself. He was considered sane enough on every subject except that of buffalo bones. His weakness for these had abundant chance to show itself, for they were everywhere. There were more bones on the plains than anything else, unless it was sandhills of cacti. There was hardly a mile in the journey of the freighter when he was out of sight of some gleaming white buffalo skeleton, and in many places there were great heaps of them. These piles indicated where there had been some special slaughter of the big animals. As every student of Western history knows, thousands of them had been killed for their hides alone, and often for the mere gratification of the instinct for slaughter. The average Texan would no more have thought of using the bones than he would have thought of using cactus thorns or coyotes. He supposed when the hide had been taken, the principal part of the animal was gone, and that when the flesh had decayed, the last chance of using the carcass had disappeared. Just there was where Mr. Kilfoile seemed to differ with the average Texan. Every spare week he could get, he would devote to hauling these bones together and depositing them in tremendous heaps. On his return trips, when his wagon would otherwise have been empty, he would load up with about a ton of bones and haul them to the nearest big pile. These heaps soon began to be a noticeable feature on the landscape. By years of bleaching, under the hot rays of a Texas sun, the bones had acquired a snowy whiteness that gleamed in the sunlight with dazzling effect. Through the clear atmosphere of the plains, the big piles could be seen at a distance of many miles. Strangers inquiring their way to their destination were directed to go to a certain bone pile and then to change their course according to another one. These directions were frequently accompanied by the explanation that the piles in question were the work of a crazy fellow who devoted a large part of his time to this fruitless work. Jim must have heard remarks of this kind, but he seemed little disturbed by them. He was of retiring disposition and never frequented the saloons and gambling halls where many of the other freighters spent much of their time. In fact, he was so busy with his bone piling that he had little time for dissipation, even had he been inclined in that direction. Every time he started a bone pile, he was careful to put his mark upon it. To do this, he would select the skull of some monster bull, and upon the broad white expanse of forehead, he would scrawl with charcoal a big black K. This latter process was considered by his friends as the final and convincing evidence of his insanity. It's crazy enough in Jim to be piling them bones at all, remarked one freighter to another, but it's a heap crazier for him to be putting his brand on them as if he was afraid someone would steal them. He'd just as well be branding turkey buzzards or coyotes. He couldn't give the pesky things away. When this remark was repeated to Jim, he flushed a little, tugged at his stubby sandy beard for a moment, and then, without saying a word, went on piling bones. In 1884, It began to be rumored that a railroad was to be built through the Panhandle. It seems almost incredible that at so recent a date, it should have been considered almost an impossibility that a railroad should penetrate any portion of the United States. Yet such was the case. At first, the freighters poo-pooed at the idea. They ridiculed as an absurdity the notion that a railroad would cross such a desert as the Great Staked Plains. In the summer of 1886, though, when the preliminary survey of the Fort Worth and Denver passed through the Panhandle, the freighters began to take a more serious view of the matter. They realized that their occupation was beginning to be endangered. Just about this time, it suddenly began to be hinted that perhaps, after all, Crazy Jim was not quite so crazy as had been formerly believed. Nobody knew just how this rumor got circulated, but it's a matter of local history in the Panhandle that Mr. Kilfoile was called Boney Jim almost exclusively from that time on. In 1887, the last rail of the Fort Worth and Denver road was laid. Sometime before that, Kilfoile had abandoned freighting altogether and had been devoting all his time to hauling his bones to the railroad. He had even been hiring a score or so of other freighters to help him in the work. When the road was ready to receive freight, there was an abundance of freight ready for it. At every way station, sidetrack, or switch for 150 miles, there was a monster pile of bones, stacked up after the fashion of cordwood. Many of these stacks were 8 or 10 feet high, and more than half a mile long. They represented the patient accumulation of one man during years of quiet, unremitting labor, amid the sneers and jibes of his more short-sighted fellows. Prominent among the crowd of businessmen who followed the railroad into the country, seeking profitable investments for their capital, was the St. Louis contractor and capitalist named John Young. He had originally intended to deal in hides, but he knew a good thing when he saw it, and hence he decided to deal in bones. After some deliberation, he offered to buy Boney Jim's whole supply of bones at prices ranging from $6 to $8 per ton, according to the grade of the bones. This offer was promptly accepted, as Mr. Young shipped them to St. Louis, and there sold them for from $13 to $15 a ton. It may readily be seen that, even after paying heavy freight charges on them, he was not compelled to find his reward solely in the consciousness of having done a good deed and rewarding Boney Jim's patient labors. As soon as it became clearly understood that buffalo bones had a value, the advantage of the big K placed on Kilfoile's piles began to be apparent. Once or twice, certain of the lawless helped themselves to the bones in spite of this warning. Then it suddenly appeared that Boney had another accomplishment besides bone gathering. He could shoot. He could do this almost as well as he could gather bones. When this fact had become clearly demonstrated once or twice in actual practice, the buffalo bones became bones of contention in court. The courts held that by virtue of the fact that Kilfoile had stacked the bones and put his mark upon them, he had a valid title to them. The decisions to this effect were generally respected, and Kilfoile's six-shooters almost universally credited with a share of the work of upholding the majesty of the courts in this particular. Hundreds of the teamsters now went to work at the bone business, with the result that prices soon fell, except in the case of those already contracted for. However, Boney Kilfoile had already picked over the biggest piles of them. Even today, the Panhandle rancher occasionally sends out his hands to pick up a few solitary skeletons that have hitherto escaped the eye of the bone men. Kilfoile received over $25,000 in cash for his bones. After selling all of them, he suddenly disappeared from the scene of Panhandle history. Some say that he was murdered for his money, but the accuracy of this statement cannot be verified. This story came from the great state of Pennsylvania, being reported in the Philadelphia Times of December 6, 1896. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, now remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.